Every farmer listening to this has heard the same sentence. Maybe from an agronomist, maybe from a fertilizer representative, maybe from a university recommendation printed 30 years ago and never questioned again. Your soil pH is low. You need lime. Simple, logical, scientific, and comforting. Because lime feels like control. You spread it, you wait, you expect yields to recover. And when they don't, the explanation is always convenient. Not enough lime, wrong timing, bad weather, genetics, market conditions, anything except the uncomfortable possibility. Balanced pH is not the same thing as productive soil. And today we're going to walk straight into one of agriculture's quietest yield traps. Not because lime doesn't work, but because farmers were taught to believe it fixes problems it was never designed to solve. The industry playbook. Let's rewind. For decades, soil management has followed a predictable workflow. Pull soil sample. Check pH. Apply lime to reach target range. Expect nutrient efficiency improvement. On paper, this makes perfect sense. Most crops perform best between pH 6.0 and 6.8. Textbook agronomy. University charts show nutrient availability curves lining up beautifully inside that range. Clean lines, smooth graphs. Reality, unfortunately, refuses to behave like a textbook diagram. Because fields with perfect pH routinely underperform, and fields outside the ideal range sometimes produce record yields. That contradiction should have triggered massive curiosity. Instead, the industry doubled down. More lime recommendations, more correction programs, more dependence. Because pH is measurable, and measurable things sell solutions. The psychological trap farmers never notice. Here's the uncomfortable truth. pH became agriculture's favorite metric not because it explains yield, but because it simplifies complexity. Soil biology is messy, structure is invisible, water movement changes weekly, root interaction happens underground where nobody sees it. But pH? One number, easy to print, easy to prescribe, easy to invoice. The moment agriculture reduced soil health to a single chemical indicator, management shifted from understanding systems to managing symptoms. And lime became the universal prescription. What lime actually does? Let's reset expectations. Lime performs three primary functions: neutralizes acidity, supplies calcium, and sometimes magnesium, reduces aluminum toxicity in acidic soils. That's it. Notice what's missing. Lime does not create soil structure, increase organic matter, restore microbial diversity, fix compaction, improve oxygen diffusion, build aggregation, increase root exploration capacity. Yet farmers quietly expect all of those outcomes after liming. Because yield drag feels chemical. But most yield drag is physical and biological. The yield plateau nobody talks about. Across North America, South America, and Australia, a pattern keeps repeating. Farmers lime aggressively. pH reaches target. Nutrient programs improve. Inputs increase. But yields stall. Not collapse. Just stall. That plateau is dangerous. Because it looks acceptable. You still harvest. You still profit some years. But the system stops responding proportionally to investment. More fertilizer. Same yield response. More correction. Diminishing return. And eventually, profitability erosion disguised as normal farming risk. The hidden question nobody asked. Here's the question rarely discussed in agronomy meetings. If pH correction unlocks nutrients, why do roots still struggle in perfectly corrected soils? Why do crops show drought stress early? Why does nitrogen efficiency remain inconsistent? Why do response curves flatten after liming? The answer begins underground, not chemically, structurally. Because plants don't grow in chemistry charts. They grow in pore space. And lime cannot rebuild pore architecture destroyed by decades of mechanical disturbance and oxidation. The first crack in the pH myth. Researchers started noticing something strange decades ago. Two fields, same soil type, same crop, same rainfall, same fertilizer program, same pH, different yields, sometimes dramatically different. The difference? Root depth. One soil allowed roots to explore. The other restricted them. Both chemically balanced, only one biologically functional. That observation quietly undermines the entire assumption behind lime-first management. Because nutrient availability means nothing if roots cannot physically reach nutrients. Comfort versus performance. Lime provides reassurance. It feels proactive. You corrected something measurable. You followed recommendations. You did what responsible farmers are supposed to do. But agriculture has a dangerous habit, confusing activity with progress. And balanced pH often becomes a checkbox that stops deeper investigation. Once pH looks good on paper, attention shifts away from the real limiting factors. Exactly where yield loss hides. Coming next. In part 2, we're going deeper into the mechanism almost nobody explains clearly. Why calcium from lime sometimes improves yields temporarily, and then silently makes soil harder, tighter, and less responsive over time. The moment when correction turns into dependency. And why some of the highest performing soils in the world stopped treating pH as the primary driver decades ago. For years, farmers have been told a simple story. If yields are slipping, check pH. If fertilizer efficiency drops, apply lime. If crops look stressed, correct acidity. And somewhere along the way, agriculture accepted an idea so completely that almost nobody questions it anymore. Balanced pH equals productive soil. It sounds scientific, it sounds responsible, it sounds safe, but safety and performance are not the same thing. Because across thousands of farms, something strange keeps happening. Fields reach the recommended pH range. Soil tests look perfect, nutrient programs improve, yet yields refuse to move. Not catastrophic failure, just quiet stagnation, the kind that slowly eats profitability while everyone blames weather, hybrids, markets, or timing. The industry response is predictable. Apply more lime, maintain correction, stay within the ideal range. But here's the uncomfortable reality most growers never hear clearly stated. Lime fixes acidity, it does not fix soil function. And confusing those two ideas created one of the most expensive traps in modern agriculture. When agronomy simplified soil health into a number between 6 and 7, management became chemical instead of biological. pH became agriculture's comfort metric. One number, one recommendation, one solution, easy to measure, easy to sell, but crops do not grow inside laboratory curves showing nutrient availability. They grow inside living structures made of pores, aggregates, microorganisms, water pathways, and oxygen exchange. And none of those are repaired simply by neutralizing acidity. Lime performs 3 very specific tasks. It reduces hydrogen concentration, it supplies calcium or magnesium, it lowers aluminum toxicity in acidic environments. That's important work, but notice what lime does not do. It does not loosen compacted layers. It does not rebuild soil aggregation. It does not restore microbial ecosystems damaged by disturbance. It does not increase organic carbon stability. It does not improve infiltration in structurally degraded soils. Yet farmers often expect yield recovery after liming because the recommendation implies limitation removal. If acidity was the problem, correcting acidity should restore performance. Except yield drag rarely comes from chemistry alone. Most long-term productivity loss comes from physical restriction. Roots struggling for oxygen, water moving incorrectly through the profile, biology losing habitat. And here is where the balanced pH trap quietly forms. Once soil tests show acceptable numbers, investigation stops. The field appears corrected, management moves on, but underground, root systems may still encounter dense layers formed by years of traffic, oxidation of organic matter, and collapsing pore networks. From the surface, everything looks right. Below ground, exploration is limited. A plant with restricted roots behaves exactly like a nutrient-deficient plant. Even when nutrients are present. This is why 2 neighboring fields with identical pH frequently produce dramatically different yields. Same fertilizer, same rainfall, same hybrid, different root access. Nutrient availability means nothing if roots cannot physically reach nutrients or water reserves. And here's the part rarely discussed in fertilizer meetings. Calcium from lime can temporarily improve soil behavior. Flocculation increases, surface aggregation improves, early crop response looks promising. Farmers see greener plants, better emergence, short-term validation, but when biological activity and organic matter rebuilding do not follow, calcium dominance can slowly tighten soil structure instead of stabilizing it. Particles align, pores collapse under traffic, water infiltration becomes inconsistent, the soil becomes chemically corrected but physically resistant. At that point, more lime often gets recommended again years later. Not because acidity returned as the primary issue, but because productivity declined again. Correction becomes cyclical, dependency replaces understanding. Meanwhile, the real driver of yield performance remains mostly ignored. Soil architecture. Healthy soils are not defined by pH alone. They are defined by continuity of pore space, air movement, water storage, biological interaction zones. Roots follow oxygen before nutrients. Microbes follow carbon before chemistry. And structure governs both. Some of the highest yielding soils in the world operate successfully outside textbook pH targets. Not because chemistry doesn't matter, but because structure and biology compensate. Deep rooting systems buffer nutrient variability. Organic matter stabilizes moisture. Microbial processes regulate availability dynamically instead of chemically. Those systems do not chase balance. They build resilience. The tragedy is that many farmers are investing heavily in correction while unknowingly managing symptoms instead of causes. Yield plateaus appear. Input response weakens. Fertilizer efficiency declines. And profitability erosion gets labeled as modern farming reality. But the soil isn't failing. It's signaling limitation in the wrong category. Chemical correction cannot replace biological function. And lime, while valuable, became agriculture's default answer to problems it cannot solve alone. The real question isn't whether lime works. It clearly does under true acidity constraints. The question is whether balanced pH became a stopping point instead of a starting point. Because once pH looks good on paper, curiosity often ends. And yield potential quietly stays underground, unreachable by roots trapped in soils that are technically corrected but functionally restricted. The farms breaking yield ceilings today are not abandoning lime. They are redefining its role. Correction when necessary, but structure first, biology second, chemistry supporting both, not leading them. And once management shifts from chasing numbers toward rebuilding function, something unexpected happens. Inputs begin working again, water stress decreases, root depth expands, and yield response returns without constantly increasing cost. Balanced pH was never the enemy. Believing it was enough, was. What happens next is where most farms unknowingly enter the performance ceiling. Because once pH correction stops delivering noticeable yield gains, management usually moves toward increasing inputs rather than questioning assumptions. More nitrogen, more phosphorus, more biological additives, more foliar rescue applications. Each season becomes slightly more expensive than the last. And the frustrating part is this. Nothing looks dramatically wrong. Plants emerge, fields stay green, harvest still happens, but response efficiency fades. Fertilizer that once produced strong gains now delivers marginal improvement. Water stress appears earlier during dry periods. Root digs reveal something farmers often describe the same way across continents. Roots just aren't going down like they used to. That observation matters more than almost any soil test number. Because yield potential is not determined by what exists in the top 6 inches of soil. It is determined by how far roots can safely explore. Every additional inch of rooting depth represents stored water, nutrient buffering, and temperature stability. When roots stop early, yield stops early. And here's the uncomfortable connection rarely explained clearly. Repeated lime-first management can unintentionally reinforce shallow rooting systems when structural rebuilding does not occur alongside chemical correction. Calcium improves aggregation only when biology is actively producing binding agents such as glomalin, microbial polysaccharides, and decomposing organic residues. Without biological activity, calcium alone cannot maintain stable aggregates under mechanical pressure. Instead, soil particles rearrange over time into denser configurations. Traffic compresses them, rainfall seals surfaces, pores connecting deeper layers gradually disappear. From above, nothing signals disaster. But underground, resistance increases. Roots encounter mechanical limitation long before chemical limitation. Plants respond predictably. They concentrate roots near the surface where oxygen remains available. Nutrient uptake becomes weather dependent. During wet periods, crops look excellent. During dry weeks, stress appears rapidly. Farmers often interpret this as rainfall variability. In reality, it is exploration limitation. The plant simply cannot reach stored resources deeper in the profile. And here's where the balanced pH belief becomes dangerous. Because soil tests taken from shallow sampling depths continue showing optimal conditions. Numbers validate management decisions, yet the active rooting zone keeps shrinking. Agronomy unintentionally begins managing the topsoil while yield depends on the subsoil. This disconnect explains one of modern agriculture's most confusing observations. Why high input systems sometimes show lower resilience than moderate input systems built around soil function. Resilience is not purchased through chemistry. It is constructed through architecture. Healthy soil behaves less like powder and more like sponge. Water infiltrates instead of running off. Air exchanges continuously. Microbial populations occupy protected pore environments. Roots move vertically without resistance. None of this appears directly on a pH report. And because it cannot be summarized in a single number, it receives less management attention. Now consider what happens during rainfall events on structurally weakened but chemically corrected soil. Water enters quickly at first, then slows, then moves laterally instead of downward. Oxygen displacement increases. Temporary saturation occurs. Microbial respiration shifts. Nitrogen losses accelerate through denitrification. Farmers compensate with additional nitrogen applications. Costs rise again. The cycle reinforces itself. The assumption becomes that modern hybrids simply require more fertility. But many times, the system is compensating for poor soil function rather than feeding crop demand. The soil is leaking efficiency. And lime cannot seal structural leaks. Another overlooked consequence emerges over time. Surface-dominant rooting increases temperature sensitivity. Topsoil heats faster. Moisture evaporates sooner. Microbial mineralization spikes briefly, then collapses. Nutrient availability becomes inconsistent across the season. Yield variability increases even inside the same field. Precision agriculture tools map symptoms beautifully. But maps rarely explain causes. Prescription zones increase. Management complexity grows. Yet underlying limitation remains physical. The irony is almost painful. Farmers invest heavily in technology designed to manage variability created by degraded structure that basic soil function could have prevented. Balanced pH becomes maintenance, not improvement, and maintenance without functional recovery slowly drains margins. Some farmers begin noticing something counterintuitive. Fields receiving less disturbance often outperform heavily managed areas despite similar fertility programs. Residue-covered soils remain cooler. Moisture lasts longer. Root channels persist year after year. Biological activity stabilizes aggregation naturally. These systems do not ignore chemistry. They simply stop expecting chemistry to lead recovery. Instead, biology rebuilds poor networks first. Chemistry becomes supportive rather than corrective. When this transition occurs, fertilizer response curves change dramatically. Nitrogen efficiency improves. Phosphorus availability stabilizes. Yield response becomes more predictable across weather extremes. Not because nutrients increased, but because access increased. The plant finally interacts with the full soil profile again. And once roots regain depth, something remarkable happens. Lime requirements often decrease over time, not because acidity disappears magically, but because biological buffering strengthens. Organic matter moderates pH fluctuations locally around roots. Microbial processes regulate nutrient exchange dynamically. The system begins self-adjusting rather than requiring constant intervention. At this stage, soil stops behaving like a medium requiring correction and starts behaving like an ecosystem providing service. The balanced pH trap was never about lime being harmful. It was about believing correction alone restores performance. Agriculture optimized chemistry faster than it rebuilt biology, and yield ceilings quietly followed. The next step forces an even harder question. If pH correction is not the primary driver of long-term productivity, what actually determines whether fertilizer investments translate into grain? Because the answer challenges one of the most repeated recommendations in modern soil management. And once farmers understand it, input strategy changes permanently. At some point, every farmer reaches the same moment. Inputs are optimized, equipment is modern, genetics are strong, recommendations are followed precisely. And still, yield response refuses to scale with investment. This is where conversations usually shift toward markets, climate volatility, or seed technology. Rarely toward soil interpretation itself. Because questioning soil recommendations feels almost uncomfortable. They come from universities, from decades of research, from trusted advisors, but agriculture has quietly inherited one assumption that reshaped management decisions worldwide. The belief that chemical balance automatically produces physical performance. And nowhere is this assumption more influential than in base saturation theory. Most growers have seen the chart. Ideal calcium percentage, ideal magnesium range, target potassium balance, adjust the ratios, stabilize the soil, unlock yield. It sounds precise, mathematical, controlled, but soil does not operate like a nutritional spreadsheet. Base saturation describes occupancy of exchange sites. It does not describe how soil behaves under rainfall, traffic, or root pressure. Two soils may show identical calcium saturation levels and behave completely differently in the field. One friable, one dense, one resilient, one prone to sealing, Because structure depends less on ratios alone and far more on biological binding and organic carbon dynamics. Here's the critical misunderstanding. Calcium is often called the element that loosens soil, and under active biological conditions, that statement holds partial truth. Aggregation improves, porosity increases, but without organic glues produced by living systems, those aggregates lack durability. They collapse under stress, machinery passes once, rainfall impacts repeatedly, surface tension reorganizes particles again, the soil settles tighter than before. Farmers frequently interpret this as magnesium excess or renewed acidity. More amendments follow, more adjustment, but the underlying issue remains absence of stable aggregation mechanisms. Biology builds permanence, chemistry alone builds temporary condition, and temporary improvement creates one of agriculture's most misleading feedback loops. Short-term success validates long-term dependency. After liming, crops often improve during the first seasons. Root toxicity declines, early growth strengthens, confidence increases, but if organic matter continues declining or disturbance remains high, structural degradation resumes quietly. Years later, performance slips again. The conclusion feels obvious: the soil needs correction again. Yet the cycle repeats not because chemistry failed, but because biology never recovered enough to maintain structure. This explains why some fields require repeated liming far more frequently than expected. The buffering system is weak. Organic carbon levels cannot stabilize pH microsites around roots. Microbial respiration fluctuates violently with moisture and temperature. Chemical correction becomes external life support. Meanwhile, soils with strong biological systems often tolerate wider pH ranges without productivity loss. Roots modify their immediate environment through exudates. Microorganisms cycle nutrients continuously. Local conditions around roots differ significantly from bulk soil measurements. Plants experience function, not averages. And averages are exactly what soil tests report. Now consider fertilizer efficiency inside these two systems. In structurally functional soil, nutrients remain accessible longer. Water movement distributes ions gradually. Roots intercept nutrients throughout depth. Loss pathways slow down. In structurally degraded soil, nutrients move unpredictably. Leaching increases. Denitrification spikes. Surface drying interrupts uptake. Farmers respond logically. Split applications, higher rates, insurance feeding. Costs increase to compensate for instability. But instability originates from physical limitation, not nutrient shortage. Balanced chemistry sitting inside dysfunctional structure behaves like fuel poured beside an engine instead of inside it. Everything required exists. Delivery fails. This realization changes how yield limitation is diagnosed. Instead of asking, what nutrient is missing, the better question becomes, what prevents roots from accessing what already exists? Often the answer includes compaction layers invisible to shallow sampling, collapsed pore networks reducing oxygen flow, organic matter stratification trapping biology near the surface, repeated disturbance accelerating carbon loss faster than replacement, none corrected by additional lime. And here lies the turning point many progressive farmers eventually reach. They stop treating soil as a chemistry problem requiring adjustment, and start treating it as infrastructure requiring rebuilding. Infrastructure determines flow, water flow, air flow, energy flow, nutrient flow. When infrastructure functions, chemistry becomes dramatically more efficient. When infrastructure fails, chemistry becomes increasingly expensive. This is why some farms suddenly experience yield breakthroughs without massive increases in fertilizer. Nothing magical occurred. Roots simply regained territory. Every inch deeper expands resilience. Access to subsoil moisture delays drought stress. Nutrient pools previously unreachable become active contributors. Microbial habitats expand vertically. The system stabilizes. And interestingly, once function improves, lime applications become more strategic rather than routine. Applied when acidity genuinely limits biology or root growth, not automatically triggered by a number slightly outside recommendation range, correction becomes precise instead of habitual. At this stage, farmers often notice something unexpected. Yield variability decreases more than average yield increases. Bad years improve first, stress tolerance rises, profitability stabilizes. Because resilience, not maximum output, determines long-term success. The balanced pH trap convinced agriculture that equilibrium on paper equals performance in the field. But real performance emerges from interaction between physics, biology, and chemistry working together. Remove one pillar, and the system compensates inefficiently. Restore all three, and inputs begin behaving differently. The final piece of this discussion forces the hardest realization yet. If lime is not the primary lever behind sustained yield improvement, then what management decisions actually separate stagnant farms from those consistently breaking yield ceilings? Because the answer has less to do with adding something, and far more to do with stopping certain practices long enough for soil systems to recover their natural engineering. Eventually, the discussion stops being about lime, and starts being about control. Because farmers were never really chasing balanced pH. They were chasing predictability, stable yields, reliable response, confidence that investment turns into harvest. And for decades, chemical correction felt like the most logical path toward that control. Measure the soil, correct the number, expect performance. But soil systems do not reward correction alone. They reward function. The farms quietly separating themselves today are not necessarily using less lime. They are using it differently. Lime stopped being the foundation of productivity. It became maintenance inside a functioning system. And that distinction changes everything. High-performing soils share characteristics rarely listed in fertilizer recommendations. Continuous root presence, minimal structural disturbance, permanent biological feeding through residues or cover systems, water infiltration exceeding rainfall intensity, stable aggregation surviving traffic and weather cycles. In those environments, pH still matters. But it stops dominating decision-making. Because once biological buffering strengthens, plants experience microenvironments far more stable than bulk soil measurements suggest. Roots release organic acids, microbes exchange nutrients dynamically, carbon compounds regulate localized chemistry continuously. The plant is no longer dependent on uniform soil conditions across the entire field. It engineers its own environment. And suddenly, something remarkable happens. Inputs begin behaving as originally promised. Nitrogen lasts longer. Phosphorus response improves without dramatic rate increases. Micronutrient deficiencies decline. Stress recovery accelerates. Not because fertilizer change, because access change. Efficiency replaced compensation. This is the moment many growers describe as soil coming back to life. But nothing mystical occurred. Infrastructure recovered. Poor continuity allowed oxygen movement again. Water entered instead of escaping. Biology stabilized aggregates naturally. Roots explored deeper horizons year after year. Yield gains followed function, not correction. And here lies the uncomfortable conclusion behind the balanced pH trap. Agriculture unintentionally trained farmers to fix what was easiest to measure instead of what most strongly limited production. pH became visible progress. Structure remained invisible risk. Biology remained underestimated capital. So when yields slowed, correction intensified. Yet every additional input applied into dysfunctional soil delivered smaller returns. The industry interpreted this as increasing crop demand. In many cases, it was declining system efficiency. The soil required rebuilding, not more adjustment. This realization does not mean lime recommendations were wrong. Acid soils absolutely restrict productivity. Aluminum toxicity is real. Nutrient availability shifts matter. But correction was never meant to carry the entire burden of soil performance. It was step one. Somewhere along the way, step one became the entire strategy. And strategies built on single variables rarely survive complex systems. The farmers breaking yield ceilings today tend to follow a different sequence. First, protect structure. Limit unnecessary disturbance where possible. Keep living roots active longer through the season. Feed microbial populations consistently with carbon sources. Improve infiltration before increasing fertility rates. Then correct chemistry precisely where limitation truly exists. When this order reverses, inputs fight the soil. When this order aligns, inputs cooperate with it. Profitability follows cooperation. Another shift becomes visible over time. Weather stops dictating outcomes as aggressively. Dry periods hurt less. Heavy rainfall causes less damage. Yield maps smooth out. Risk declines. And perhaps most importantly, decision fatigue decreases. Management moves from constant correction toward system guidance. The farmer stops reacting every season and starts steering long-term performance. Balanced pH was never the enemy. Blind reliance on balance was. Because soil productivity does not emerge from equilibrium alone. It emerges from interaction, physics allowing movement, biology sustaining structure, chemistry supporting exchange. Remove any one, and efficiency collapses. Restore all three, and agriculture begins working with natural processes instead of continuously compensating against them. The real lesson is not to stop liming. It is to stop expecting lime to fix problems created by structural loss, biological decline, or management pressure accumulated over decades. Once that expectation disappears, recommendations change, investments change, and yield potential often reveals itself without dramatic increases in cost. In the end, the question every farmer faces is simple. Are you correcting soil numbers or restoring soil function? Because one maintains the present, the other unlocks the future. And the difference between those two paths is where modern yield gaps are quietly decided every single season.